Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. Philosophers have given a lot of attention to blame in the past, but not so much to praise. This might be because praise looks fairly unproblematic on the whole. Praising people's nice. It boosts people's self-confidence, strengthens social bonds, and if we occasionally praise people who don't really deserve our praise, who cares? According to Jules Holroyd, a philosopher working at the University of Sheffield, while this attitude is probably right overall, there are a few unusual cases where we can praise people in a way that causes some moral problems, and we should be on the lookout for these cases. In this conversation, we talked about some of the moral norms that govern praise, when it is and isn't appropriate to praise someone. And in particular, we looked at the ways in which our acts of praising can signal a commitment to wider social norms, some of which we might not want to endorse. Jules, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
And we're here to talk about praise today. So I thought we could maybe start by just contextualising that a little bit. So praise is kind of one of the practices that philosophers are interested in, just kind of everyday interpersonal practices. And I suppose in a similar sort of area of life to, some concepts that we talked about in a previous episode where we discussed forgiveness, punishment and revenge. I suppose you might think that praise is kind of in a similar general area to those. But it's often thought of as the counterpart of blame, right? And one of the things that's interesting is that in contrast to blame, which has had an awful lot of philosophical attention, praise has had much less attention. Philosophers have written much less about praise. So I was wondering if you could say why you think that is.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. Because as you say, I think praise is one of a range of sort of responses we have to people's sort of moral doings, things that they do. But I think that it's generally assumed that praise is a nice thing that benefits people. And so whereas things like blame or resentment require sort of special justification for it to be okay for us to do them, to go in for those kinds of responses, praise doesn't seem to really need much justification. It seems like we're just doing a nice thing for somebody else. And then I think the other consideration is that, so although you're right that there hasn't been a lot of sort of detailed philosophical analysis of praise, the word praise often crops up in philosophical writings about responsibility, but in the same sentence as blame and praiseworthiness or praise and blameworthiness. Yeah. And then the discussion will focus mainly on blame, and there's an assumption that, the same will go, it's going to be a sort of symmetrical analysis for praise, and it doesn't get scrutinised on its own terms. So I think those two reasons have sort of explained why there hasn't been that much attention to praise.
Right, so there's an assumption that if you can work out when it's appropriate to blame people, then you can just read off when it's going to be appropriate to praise people as well. But you think that's not quite right?
Yeah, I don't think it seems like it's an open question whether or not the same kinds of sort of justifying conditions for praise will hold, and the same kinds of norms about the expression of praise will hold as for blame. And some people have argued, they're not actually symmetrical, and so we need to think really carefully about praise in its own terms, which seems right to me.
Yeah, okay. One of the points that you make is that when we kind of do these things, not just praise, but also blame and other what you call responsibility practices, there are multiple things that we might be trying to do that might be underlying what we're doing there. And so specifically, you say that sometimes those practices are desert tracking and sometimes they're concerned more with agent cultivation. So could you say a bit more about what you mean by those?
Yeah, so I suppose some theorists have focused on one or other of those and said, really what we're trying to do when we go in for praise and blame is track the extent to which somebody's actions is something that they're creditable for, that it's genuinely attributable to them, that we can kind of hold them accountable for. It really reflects on them as a person. Whereas other theorists have said, well, the point of these practices is not that kind of backward-looking, trying to track the deservingness of the person, but rather a forward-looking practice that's trying to bring about good consequences or create sort of or shape moral agency in some way. And I think, along with some other philosophers, that it's very plausible that both of those things have a role in our practices, that sometimes we might be doing both of those things at the same time, but other times we might just be focusing more on one or the other. For example, I think in relation to children, often what we're doing with our reactive attitudes and with our responses, in particular our praising responses, is trying to shape their agency so that they become sort of well-developed moral beings. And we're not really, concerned so much with the extent to which they deserve praise. Whereas in other contexts, it's more the desert considerations, the fact that we think something really reflects well on somebody, that it's creditable to them, that's guiding our use of praise.
Yeah, I wonder if the case of children, it seems to me that actually a lot of these responsibility practices come out slightly differently when you talk about children, right? So even blame, I've got children, when I sort of blame them for doing something and tell them off, I'm not thinking kind of deeply about whether they're genuinely morally responsible for what they've done. Especially young children. It's more that you think, well, you've got to set up the idea that they shouldn't do that, and you've got to kind of encourage certain practices or patterns of thought. So it looks like even with blame, really, like quite often it's less important whether they're strictly morally responsible for what they're doing. But with praise, actually, it might be, even with adults, quite often, it's just less important whether we think they're morally responsible, and just praising them might be more to do with kind of trying to be encouraging.
Yes. Like that. Yeah, I think that's right. I think sort of encouragement and sort of showing what values we want to celebrate, what things we want to promote and we think are worth promoting and encourage people to promote in future. I think that's a really key part of our praising practices.
Great. Yeah, okay. And we'll definitely get onto that in a moment. So there are a couple of things that you think are sort of specific to praise. So one of those is what you've just alluded to, actually. So the idea that when we're praising, quite often what we're doing is just kind of signaling what's important, or kind of, signaling commitment to values and sort of trying to encourage commitment to values in others, maybe. The other one is that praise seems like more elective than other practices. So could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so in fact, I'm not sure about the extent to which these are distinctive features of praise. So it might turn out that they're also true of other moral responses as well. But I want to really, focus on and highlight the extent to which I think praise is elective. So it seems like we have a great deal of discretion over whether we express praise at all, how we do it, when we do it. So I think that's a really significant feature, partly because I think the choices that we make about when we do that is really then significant in showing what things we do value and what things we do want to promote and celebrate. And I think that the role that praise has in sort of affirming our values and entrenching our values, I think, again, that isn't something that's been absent from some of the other literatures. So it gets sort of remarked upon in relation to blame. But one of the reasons why I really want to focus on it is that there's been a bit of a tendency, I think, both in thinking about responses like blame, but in particular in thinking about responses like praise, to focus on them as kind of communicative acts, like communications from one person to another.
Right.
A sort of I think it's called dyadic praise, like one person praising another person. And that seems to me to leave out the wider audience. And I think often when we're praising, it's not just for the direct target of the praise, it's also for the wider audience. And indeed, we often praise when the direct target, the praiseworthy person, isn't there. And I think that really brings to light this role of praise in sort of signalling our values and entrenching and affirming our values.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You're kind of specifically interested in this signalling function of praise. So I suppose, well, like as you said at the beginning, praise just looks like a nice thing to do, right? So in a way, that's why perhaps people have been less kind of concerned with the norms of praise, like when it's appropriate to praise and so on, because in the vast majority of cases, just looks like it's a good thing to do. And if you're praising too much, well, nothing very terrible is going to happen as a result of that. But there are some cases that look a bit more problematic, right, where actually by praising we might be causing problems, and you've got a couple of cases there, so would you mind going through those?
Yeah, so the cases that got me really interested in thinking about praise were cases where I think praise is being used for oppressive purposes, and the values that are being signalled are problematic ones, and I think this is actually quite a common phenomenon, and I'm sure people can think of their own examples, but here are some that have really got me interested in the way we praise. So one of them is drawn from the work of Serene Kader and Matthew Lindauer. They've got a case that they call the daddy dividend, and they're basically drawing attention to the sort of gendered and racialized dimensions of praise. The fact that as a white man, Matt Lindauer gets praised for participating in basic parenting tasks in a way that Serene Kader does not. So I think that's a really interesting case where there's a problematic sort of gender dynamic in the way that the praise is being distributed. Like there seems to be a problematic asymmetry in who's getting the praise. Yeah.
So in that, I think, sorry to interrupt, in the description of the case, it's something like, somebody's on a train or something, are they? It's a man's on a train with his child, and somebody goes, "Well done, you're the best dad ever."
Exactly.
Kind of thing. Yeah. And all he's doing is he's got his baby in a sling sort of thing. It's just very, very basic parenting, and so there seems like there's something problematic with praising somebody for doing something.
Yeah, and I think part of what's problematic is that it's expressing really low expectations for fathers. Yeah. Like we don't expect much of you, such that when you do the basics, like hold your baby, you're wildly accoladed and praised for doing that.
And part of the problem is that women don't get praise for doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So that's a case that looks like it illustrates when at least sometimes praise can go wrong and can be causing problems. So you're interested in what the norms are that govern praise. So norms that make it appropriate to give praise. So, what we should praise for, who we should praise, when it's appropriate for an individual to give praise as well. And so let's go through those in turn. So you've got three norms of praise. There are distributive norms, standing norms, and epistemic norms. So the first one's distributive norms. So the thought is that there's something about fairness here. So to go back to the daddy dividend case, well, what kind of instinctively looks problematic about that case is, well, these men are getting praised for something that women aren't getting praised for, right? So there's an unfairness, there's an unequal distribution there, and that's what's the problem with the case. So do you think that gives a good account of what's going wrong in that kind of case?
No. So when I first started thinking about these cases, I thought, there's obviously something wrong with the distribution here. Like it looks like there's an unfairness in how praise is being distributed. But then I came to think that it's actually really hard to reconcile that thought that there's a problem with the distribution with the feature of praise that I mentioned earlier, namely that it's elective, that we get a lot of discretion over how, when and whether we express praise. Right. If that's the case, then it's quite hard to see how there might be a sort of distributive norm that requires, well, if you praise person A, then you ought also to praise person B.
Right.
So that led me to worry about how we might capture these features that look like distributive problems, but but I don't think are going to be well captured by a norm about sort of the fair distribution of praise.
Right.
And instead, I think we might want to appeal to the signalling function of praise to speak to what looks like a distributive problem.
Right.
So what I'd want to say is, whilst it's not the case that there's a kind of norm of fairness that requires that you distribute your praise equally across, for example, men and women, you do need to be careful and attentive with respect to what your expressions of praise might be signalling. So if it turns out that you're praising men and not women, you might end up signalling that, the behaviours of men, and in this context, like the behaviours of fathers in particular, are more esteem-worthy, or that they're sort of more creditable than women who engage in similar parenting activities.
Or I suppose that the responsibilities that men have in that arena of life are less.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Because by praising, you're sort of saying, well, you're going beyond your basic responsibilities, and therefore you're signalling that those responsibilities are quite minimal.
So I think that one feature of the signalling account, and I should say I'm sort of drawing this account from some of the work by David Shoemaker and Manuel Vargas, who develop a signalling account of blame, and I want to sort of see how with some changes that might be appropriate to apply to praise. But I think what I want to emphasize is that there's sort of two dimensions to what's signaled. There's the kind of signaling of the values that you're explicitly celebrating. So sort of in this instance, celebrating fathers parenting, but there's also the kinds of wider evaluative frameworks that are presupposed by that sort of more explicit celebration. In this case, you're kind of presupposing that fathers should do less parenting, or you're sort of presupposing that there'll be gender dynamics in any parenting work.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I suppose that kind of signals, or that points towards something which seems right about this kind of case, which is that the people who are praising men specifically and not women might be thinking, by doing that, I'm trying to kind of encourage men to take a more active role in parenting, and actually trying to redress some injustices that exist. But still, by doing that, they could be signalling, problematic assumptions in what they're doing.
Yes, that's right. So I definitely don't want to commit to the idea that there's anything sort of insincere or disingenuous about these instances of praise. Like somebody might be sort of genuinely trying to esteem the target of their praise. They also might be genuinely trying to sort of encourage people to in this instance, participate in parenting. But I think, notwithstanding that, it could be the case that they're sort of signalling problematic evaluative frameworks, or problematic norms, or problematic expectations. And so one thing to be attentive to in expressing praise is whether there's any kind of problematic social meanings that are getting signaled. And I think, thinking about these cases, I think so that it's one of the reasons why it's really important for philosophers to think about praise is that it might actually be really hard to do it well. Like this might be a case, as you just described, where somebody might be sort of motivated by agency cultivation considerations, and motivated by egalitarian considerations. They want equal parenting. They're keen to encourage fathers to participate in parenting, but there might nonetheless be other norms for expressing praise that are being violated in terms of the social meaning of the praise that they express. It might end up entrenching stereotypes or problematic values.
Great. Okay. So just to slightly go back to the point about distributive norms. So your thought is that this signalling idea of what we're doing with praising makes better sense of that kind of case than distribution, because basically is the thought that because kind of praise is almost always supererogatory, sort of, it's like something that we don't have to do, therefore it can't really be the case that we have to give it equally, right? So if it's just always a sort of elective, voluntary thing that we do, we can't possibly have a norm that says if we do it, we ought to do it equally. So it's not the fairness that's creating the problem here.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I don't think there's a kind of distributive norm per se for praise. So one way to illustrate this, I suppose, would be to think like imagine in the next subway carriage there was another father carrying their baby. Like the praiser isn't under any requirement that having praised Lindauer, they also now have to go and praise this other father who's doing it. You know, we get to choose when we express praise, I think. But nonetheless, there does seem something problematic with them praising Lindauer and not Surinkeda. And I think understanding when and why it's problematic is captured better by this norm to do with what you might be signalling with your praise than any kind of strictly distributive norm.
Yeah, good. Okay. So that's the distributive norms. And then the second set of norms is what you call standing norms. So what do you mean by standing norms?
In sort of colloquial terms, the idea of standing, I guess, often gets captured by thinking about how sometimes we want to respond to expressions of blame or expressions of praise by sort of saying, well, who are you to say that? What right do you have to criticize me? Or, you know, why do you care so much that I've done this thing? Often cases of sort of standingless blame, for example, get characterized as like hypocritical blame, or cases where the blame is somehow condescending. You might think, well, you know, even if it's the case that I deserve blame, there's a question about who can express it. And likewise, the question arises then with praise. Like even if praise would be justified in this case, maybe you've done something praiseworthy, there's a question about who can express that praise. Like, could it be the case that from some social positions or in some circumstances, it's inappropriate for you to express praise?
Yeah, so it's standing in the sense of whether you have the standing to give praise in a particular situation. Yeah, okay. So as you've kind of alluded to there, some of the reasons why we might think that someone doesn't have good standing to be giving praise when they are in fact giving praise is, well, when it's patronizing to do so. So I suppose that might be one thought about the daddy dividend case again. It's kind of by saying, oh, well done for doing something which is a baseline expectation of a parent, you're kind of being a bit patronizing, and that might be one thing that's going wrong.
Yeah, one thought about that case is it's patronizing because it's sort of assuming or expecting very little from men who parent.
And then another situation is where it's hypocritical to give praise. So that's kind of interesting. So just going back to what you were saying about distribution, if the thought is that praise is elective to a high degree, you might think, well, giving praise in one situation but not in another can't be hypocritical if it's just it always should be a free choice to give praise. But I suppose there might be situations where you're praising one person for doing something and actually blaming another person for doing something quite similar, where that might look hypocritical.
Yeah, so there's sort of two kinds of cases that philosophers have talked about as looking like hypocritical praise. So one kind of case that Casper Lippert Rasmussen talks about is a case where you praise yourself for doing things, but not other people. So you're very willing to give yourself lots of credit, but don't do so for the same things when other people do them. And then another kind of case that Sophia Jepson and Daphne Brandenburg have talked about as a case of hypocritical praise. Hypocritical other praise would be a case where you praise other people in relation to values that you yourself don't show much regard for. So their example is of a case where somebody praises someone for their environmentally responsible behaviour. You know, well done for not eating meat and avoiding air travel. but they themselves say, oh, but it's, too much for me to do those things.
Yeah.
Like I just like meat a bit too much, or I just couldn't imagine like giving up my annual holidays. That might.
So it's not the kind of case where because I can imagine you might be saying, well done you for being very responsible. I'm not very responsible. That seems unproblematic because you're not being hypocritical. You are actually judging yourself by the same standards, but you're just kind of falling short of them. But it's where you're letting yourself off the hook.
Yes.
But
yes.
you're praising the other person.
Yeah. You're sort of saying, look, these are values that are worthy ones, that we should celebrate people when they act in accordance with them, that we should promote, but I'm not going to be the one promoting them. Yeah.
Good. Okay. And one of the observations that you make about standing norms is that when somebody praises us and it doesn't look like they have the right standing to praise us, that gives us permission to deflect the reasons that the praise gives. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so this is drawing on an analysis of standing by Ori Herstein, who argues that standing in a range of contexts, so standing to blame, standing to give advice, standing to praise, which is what I'm interested in, might be understood in terms of permission to deflect the reasons that the expression gives. And so, I mean, I think in the case of praise, we're getting sort of non-directive reasons, right? The praise isn't demanding anything of us. It's not commanding something of us.
Yeah.
I think it gives us reasons to, as we talked a bit about, like to affirm certain values, encourage. I think the expressions of praise encourage people to pursue those values, to promote them, and to celebrate them where they're promoted. So the thought is those are the kinds of reasons that praise might give us.
Right.
And in a case of standingless praise, the recipient or audience of the praise would have permission to deflect those reasons. So they'd have permission to say, look, your expression of praise isn't an expression that urges me to pursue these values or to promote these values or to celebrate them where I see them promoted. There might be independent reasons for celebrating and promoting those values, but you're just not getting them from the expression of praise.
Yeah, and that's interesting because it seems like what should matter is whether the values are good or not, right? Not the standing of the person who's issuing the praise, which is promoting the values, right? So why do you think somebody not having standing to give praise it gives us permission in that kind of way?
So this is where, again, I think like we can appeal to the signaling function of praise and doing some work. So the thought is, if this person has shown themselves to be pretty unreliable in relation to these values, like we have reason to believe they're not really committed to them. Maybe they're not very good at like detecting where these values are instantiated or promoted. Then we have little reason to think that their expression of praise in particular gives us reason to celebrate or promote those values. So if they're not a reliable signaler of their kind of competence in relation to these values, then their expressions of praise are not going to be giving us particular reason to pursue those values. We might have independent reasons for pursuing them, but this praiser isn't a good source of reasons in relation to them.
Good. So in the case of someone who's praising you for being environmentally responsible, your reaction might be to go, well, I mean, I know I have good reason to be environmentally responsible because I've already thought about that. I know that gives me good reasons. But the fact that you're telling me that doesn't tell me anything new because you're not environmentally responsible yourself, and therefore you haven't obviously kind of made that decision in the best light, or you haven't reasoned through this in a way which would give me extra reason to think, yes, this is a good thing that I'm doing.
If I want to respond to you're trying to give me reasons to promote those values, to be environmentally responsible, it would be fine for me to say, I'm not listening to what you have to say about that. I'm going to heed the thoughts of other people who have shown themselves to be more reliable in relation to those values. But the crucial thing about it being permission to deflect rather than like the standingless praise or lacking standing in other domains invalidates reasons is the thought that whilst I have permission to deflect them, I can decide to take them up. So I could say, well, yeah, I know you're a bit unreliable, but look, we need all the encouragement we can get to pursue these values. So, okay, you're a bit flaky in your commitment, but thanks, I'll take that praise. So it's permission to deflect, but the reasons could be still there if I decide, like, actually, I'm going to waive that permission to deflect and take the reasons up. Yeah.
Great. All right. And then finally, the third set of norms that you're interested in are epistemic norms. So, the word epistemic just kind of means having to do with knowledge or belief, right? And an epistemic norm when it comes to praise is to do with whether somebody has reason to believe that the person being praised is morally responsible, right? And this is where there's an interesting comparison with blame, right? Because it looks like there's a pretty strong epistemic norm when it comes to blame. Mm-hmm. So that would be, it's unreasonable to blame someone if it's not reasonable to believe that they're morally responsible. So either they're morally responsible for the thing you're blaming them for, or you at least have really good reason to think that they are.
Yeah, that's right. So there's been some attention to the epistemic norm for blame. So Justin Coates has argued that we need to reasonably believe that the recipient of our blame is morally responsible, and Chris Kelp has argued, you should know that they've actually done something bad or wrong, and I guess that's motivated by the thought that you could impose harm on somebody unjustifiably if you didn't have reasonable beliefs, or you didn't know that they are sort of apt recipients of your blame, that they're morally responsible, or that they've actually done something wrong. Yeah. Otherwise, you might be just sort of imposing this unpleasant response on them, this blame on them, without that being something you had sort of adequate justification for. Mm-hmm. And so, my thought was, well, is there a similar epistemic norm for praise? Do you have to reasonably believe that the recipient of your praise is morally responsible, or do you need to know they've done something good or right? And I guess I think this is a case where there's a case to be made that there's an asymmetry between the norms for praise and blame. It doesn't seem obvious to me that you need to know that the recipient of the praise is morally responsible or has done something good or right, partly because although we've just been talking about like the cases where praise is problematic and could be sort of entrenching problematic values, or might be sort of look like it's unfair in some way, sort of problematic instances of praise. I think it is nonetheless the case that in many instances praise is helpful and a benefit and something nice. And in general, we don't think that it's impermissible to give people undeserved benefits, or do nice things for people, whether or not they deserve it. So the fact that praise can be a nice thing, I think, means that it's not obvious to me that we need to sort of believe that they deserve the praise in order to give it. Right.
Can you think of an example of where it might be appropriate or it might be a good thing to praise somebody, even though we don't have a strong reason to think that they're morally responsible?
I mean, I guess in relation to children, as we talked about earlier, I think it's not clear that they are morally responsible beings, at least at a pretty young age. I mean, so in fact, in another context, Coates has talked about the kind of competences that children have as a kind of incipient competence. They're sort of edging towards sensitivity to the right kind of reasons and so on. But it would be a stretch to think that young children are fully morally responsible beings. And it might indeed be that makes it inappropriate to sort of engage in blame in relation to them, but I don't think it would make it inappropriate to praise them. And in fact, in my parenting, I find that I engage in quite a lot of praise, well done, you've been kind to your sister, that kind of thing.
I mean, it seems like a very unproblematic and very positive part of parenting, right? Just distributing blame very distributing praise very freely seems great. So is the thought there? I mean, because when you're kind of praising somebody for something that you you don't really think they're morally responsible for. There is a sense in which it's kind of, it doesn't really fit well to be doing that, right? There's a sense in which you know you're doing something slightly out of the ordinary there. So is the thought, well, it's in a sense inappropriate, but it just doesn't matter very much that it's inappropriate because there are good reasons for doing it anyway?
I mean, I think it depends. So I think there might be some cases like that where you think, well, maybe this person isn't sort of deeply praiseworthy, but it's okay because we're doing something nice and encouraging them, or in sort of just, esteeming them. But I think there might be some cases where it is in a sense appropriate, like you are sort of esteeming them on the basis of something good that they've done. There's a question about the extent to which it's sort of deeply creditable to them. I mean, I think this is the case in relation to children, right? Like a 3-year-old shares their toy. There's a sense in which it is really appropriate, I think, to praise them, and not just for the sake of agency cultivation, not just like we want them to do it again, but they have shown sensitivity to reasons. They're not sort of fully developed agents, but there's a sense in which we are targeting something that's praiseworthy in the way that if we were if they'd accidentally dropped the toy in the lap of their friend, that's not attributable to them in the way that they're passing the toy to them is.
Yes.
So I think even in the cases where we don't necessarily have kind of beliefs that this is a morally responsible agent, it can nonetheless be appropriate for us to praise them. It's not that it's sort of completely unfitting or missing its target, even if maybe one of the large parts of the justification in this case is the sort of forward-looking agency cultivation.
Right.
But it still seems like there's some sort of aptness to the target of the praise there.
Right. Okay. Good. But again, it looks inappropriate where the praise signals commitment to problematic norms, or doesn't reliably signal the praiser's commitment to those norms. Right.
Yeah, so I mean, the kind of articulation of an epistemic norm for praise that I ended up sort of landing on or angling towards, which I to be honest, I think I need to think about a bit more. But the articulation of the norm that I've ended up with is motivated by the thought that where theorists have tried to articulate epistemic norms for blame, the motivation is, well, because you want to avoid harms. Whereas in the case of praise, like insofar as it's not necessarily a harm to praise somebody who doesn't deserve it, having beliefs about their deservingness or there being a morally responsible agent to whom this behaviour is creditable, that doesn't seem like it's necessary. So instead, I've sort of drawn on the kinds of harms that we've talked about in relation to the other two norms, that you might end up harming in relation to your praise if you're signalling inegalitarian values, if you're signalling something about discrepancies in who's esteem worthy, if you're expressing praise in a condescending or hypocritical way, then you might end up harming. So the epistemic norm that I've landed on for praise is, well, you ought to believe that you're not doing those things with your praise. You ought to believe, or it should be reasonable for you to believe that you're not signalling oppressive values, that you're not signalling that you kind of care more about these values when you yourself instantiate them than other people, or that your ability to detect when those values are instantiated is distorted by social hierarchies or something like that. I think a reasonable epistemic norm is that you should reasonably believe that you're not engaging in the kind of harms we've talked about in relation to the other norms.
Yeah. So we've covered 3 different kinds of norms: distributive norms, standing norms, and epistemic norms. And the kind of takeaway story is, well, in relation to all of those different kinds of norms, one of the things that we need to be paying attention to is how our praising behaviour might be entrenching or signalling or kind of promoting, values that might be problematic or might not be helpful. Right.
Yeah, that's right. So I really want to draw attention to the role that praise can play in affirming or entrenching certain values. Often it might do that in a way that's good and helpful, like we want to affirm the values of sharing and looking after each other, generosity and so on. But then there might be instances in which praise gets used in ways to signal or entrench problematic or oppressive values that value the parenting of fathers more than mothers, or that subscribe to sort of gendered distributions of work within the family. And so we need to be really careful with our praising practice that we're not entrenching problematic values.
Great. So is that the kind of takeaway that you might give for our listeners, that they, if they're kind of going about their lives and praising people, it's not to kind of praise less, but it's just to think about what you might be signalling more broadly when you are engaged in a specific act of praising?
Yeah, that's right. We can't just assume that praise is a benefit and that it's something that does no harm. That in fact praise might entrench problematic values. It might be implicated in harms. So we need to be quite careful when we're using it, and I think we should use it, but we need to be careful when we're doing that about what we're signalling and what values are underpinning it.
Great. Well, that's all we've got time for. So Jules Holroyd, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.